Greetings and welcome. We are in Senior AP English, and our objective for the hour now is to address the somewhat thorny and difficult question, what is the scientific enlightenment? We're going to use multiple terms for this epoch. The scientific enlightenment, or as often it's referred to, the age of reason. Now, if we go back to our whiteboard timeline, and we play this little game, remember, where we put a little zero there, and we talk about events before the Common Era, and we talk about events that are Common Era, remember all of that, right? Out here, for example, in BCE, we'll put 399 is the death of Socrates and all of that. Roughly 200 is the rise of Rome. Roughly 410 is the fall of Rome, right? Okay? We can start to play a game down this timeline that in regards to literature and literary dates, it's not a bad idea to kind of lock a few of these dates away in your brain. So, for example, we can work with 1000 Common Era as the epoch of Beowulf, right? That'll help you, right? We can talk about 1300 as roughly Chaucer, right? Dante, Petrarch comes to mind here as well. 1600 we'll go ahead and reference as the rise of Shakespeare, and more particularly Hamlet, right? We just finished with this whole discussion, correct? And we talk about this time period as the Renaissance, right? Now remember, the Renaissance is a rediscovery of Greco-Roman thought. Remember, that's kind of how we talked about it. Now we're ready to move on. Now we're ready to move on. And I'm going to give you, I'm working with round dates, and for those of you that have studied your history, you know that I'm being extremely liberal in this dating system. But I think if you can memorize just a few round dates and stick them in your brain, when you walk into a university math class or a science class or a history class, and they start talking about somebody you haven't heard of, but they give you a date, then you can kind of put it in general ways on your timeline that you've got locked away in your brain. So, for example, 1600 allows you to think about Shakespeare at the time of the English Renaissance. 1700 is now our next date. I'm going to give you two dates up here. And then 1800, okay? And I'm going to be working now within those kind of two, generally speaking, dates for just a moment here. 1700, we will roughly assign as the dates for the scientific enlightenment, okay? Now, obviously, the word light is used in that word. Or, as I said, the age of reason. Often it's going to be called that as well, okay? An epoch following the Renaissance. And then 1800 we'll identify as the age of Romanticism. Now, I'm not going to say anything about Romanticism today, but we will get there, okay? Now, think about this for just a second, and then all of a sudden some of this starts to make sense. Notice how I'm trying to join together multiple concepts. So Tommy and his pals from last year when you were juniors wrote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. He writes those words along with his pals when? What year? 1776. See, so you can kind of start to get a sense. We are now in our analysis and in our discussion of world thought, moving now to the very beginnings of American thought as well. Okay? And it is true to say, what many historians say, that our early foundational thinkers were products of the Enlightenment. But what does that mean? That's what we're going to talk about now. What does it mean to say they were products of the Enlightenment? What does that term even mean? Okay? Enlightenment. That's where we're headed. It is here that we've got to find some kind of a schemata or a way to try to understand this time period that we will call the scientific enlightenment. Now, I want to point out real quickly, we name these epochs or eras after the fact. Nobody wakes up in 1350 in some morning and says, I'm living in the Dark Ages or the medieval period, right? The medieval period or the Dark Ages is a term that is appropriated during the Renaissance, after the fact. Got me? The same is true for the Enlightenment. But for the very first time, you actually do start to have a few thinkers, we think of Newton, don't we, who will specifically say The time period we're living in is a different time period. It's like, finally, people kind of catch on to this. It's always intriguing to ask this question. What will your generation in 2070? And you can do some quick mathematics to think about how old will I be in 2070? What will your generation think about this time period in 2070? What will they call it? What will they say about it? Will they give it a name? Will they talk about it in regards to a particular person or group of people? Because that's kind of the way this thing gets done. I mean, you kind of look at major movements of thought or political action or whatever, and then you start to kind of frame it that way. Got me? So we talk about this time period roughly around the 1700s as the Enlightenment, and now we're going to use a term, scientific. That's an important add-on word, scientific. Now, what is science? Well, today we understand that. We go down the hall to Mr. Dupree's room or elsewhere down in that science wing, and we understand what it means to do science. What it means to do science, of course, involves what we today understand as the scientific method. What is the scientific method? Well, of course, we're talking about forming a hypothesis, correct? Some idea. We then have to test that hypothesis and collect data. That data then has to be somehow replicatable. We have to look at other individuals doing similar kinds of research, and if that data corresponds with our data, that is to say replicatable, then we're going to move that hypothesis to a position of not a surety as in absolute truth, but we begin to kind of think that makes sense. That's what we call the scientific method. Are you ready for this? That idea doesn't really get kick-started until roughly 1700. No kidding. The way I like to say it, Mr. Wilson, is prior 1700, a lot of it is called X did it. What does that mean? Well, I'm giving my lecture, and all of a sudden, we'll just use Schreiber. There Schreiber is. He falls down on the floor, and all of a sudden, stuff starts coming out. Foam starts coming out of his mouth. He's jerking around all over the floor, and then all of a sudden, he's dead. Now, we today, of course, will have a certain view of what's going on with Mr. Schreiber in regards to what's happening on the floor. Pre-1700, the only answer that can be given is X did it. I use X as a algebraic equivalent, okay? X did it. In other words, an uncertain variable, but we know that it has nothing to do with us. That is to say, God did it, or some kind of satanic demonic force did it. Are you ready for this? Before 1700, it never occurs to anyone to actually ask the simple question, why is Mr. Schreiber falling on the floor doing this? Let's find a solution to the problem so that we can, quote unquote, cure the situation. So we can make predictions about the future and other health conditions. The easiest answer, of course, pre-1700 is God did it. That's the X. In other words, Mr. Schreiber has been a bad boy, and so now he has God cursing him in some way. Believe it or not, that was actually science right up until 1700. Now, the schemata that I'll be working with is one borrowed heavily from an American philosopher named Ken Wilber. I'll be sharing this with you. If you want, you can read in more detail this. This is a schemata that has worked for my students for a number of years. If the Renaissance is a time of rediscovery, we're now going to ask about what it is when we talk about the Enlightenment. And the way we're going to talk about it is three value spheres of influence, of arts, morals, and science. Okay? Arts, morals, and science. Three different spheres of value. We'll talk about this in two ways. We'll talk about it pre-1700 and then post-1700. And what we'll do then is this will allow us to make some kind of observation about what exactly it is that is going on when we talk about the scientific enlightenment. Okay? Again, arts, morals, and science. Now, if you'll watch my whiteboard, this shall make, I hope, make some sense. Pre-1700, it looked like this. Are you ready for this? arts. What was considered to be appropriate art of any kind, whether it be sculpture, whether it be written, whether it be dramatic and performed. Arts. This was the second one. Morals. What was right and what was wrong. And the third, science. All three value spheres laid right on top of each other, and one institution got to decide what was legitimate in all three of those categories. We know what that institution was. It was what? You're right. It was the Roman Catholic Church. The church gets to say what is legitimately art. Michelangelo doesn't get paid lots of money to climb up into the ceiling of the Sistine and paint. He's doing it for a very important pontiff. Got me? Shakespeare even has to be very careful what he writes in his plays because he doesn't want to offend the church and the religious order of the day, and his Globe Theater is shut down. Got me? The arts determined by and large by the church. What about morals and what's appropriate behavior of action? Simple. The church tells you, you do it. That's why the pardoner has such power, because he has the threat of excommunication. He can say, you're misbehaving, the church will excommunicate you unless you come to me for pardon and bring your Visa card with you. Remember, it unfrees the pelf was the way that the pardoner said, right? Science, the last sphere of value. Well, we know this story, right? Galileo, all he says is, dude, will you just look through the little cylinder with the lenses? Just look through. No. Why not? Because we already know. We already know everything we need to know. All the science we need to know is appropriated in our holy book, the Bible. We don't need you telling us any more about science. And Galileo's like, dude, okay, I get it, but will you just look through? Just one time, look through. No. They won't do it. They don't want to do it. And he's toast on a post if he doesn't recant. He has to say, okay, the church is right and I'm wrong. Even though he does whisper under his breath as he leaves the room, I'm still right. And of course, we will later say, yeah, there was a whole lot that Galileo knew he was right about, but he couldn't talk about it in public. Why? Because everybody knew that what the church taught of science was science. Medicine, understandings of the stars, understandings of geography, anything you want to constitute as science, the church already has figured the answers, and the answers are there. They are solid. Got me? They are you ready for this? Non-negotiable. You don't get to argue, for example, with the church about legitimacy or not. Okay? Now, to be fair, the church is borrowing from a way of thinking that we will call Aristotelian. And they follow Aristotle, and they follow Aristotle's taxonomies. And for the most part, it served them fairly well for a while. But in the area of science, and especially medicine, this is a serious problem. So, for example, somebody's not feeling well, you go into the doctor. A lot of times the doctor won't see you except at nighttime. We know this from Chaucer. Why? Nighttime. Because he's got to walk outside the house. Why outside the house? Because before he can figure out what's wrong with you, he's got to look up at the stars. Oh, what do you mean look up at the stars? No, for reals. You got to look up at the stars and see how the stars are all aligned to know what's wrong with you. And then you come back in and go, oh, yes, now I know the problem. And then you take out this instrument that has these terrible screw thingies. They will actually strap your feet with these screw thingies and then start turning them into the bottom of your feet, where you will put a hole about the size of a dime sometimes into the bottom of your feet so you can get good blood flow. Why is that? Well, everyone knows what's wrong with you. You have bad blood. It's all sinking to the bottom of your body. We got to get all that bad blood out. Of course, today we kind of die laughing at this, like, you got to be kidding me. I'm not kidding. And lots of people die because they bleed to death. They don't even get to the sick part of tetanus. They actually just bleed straight to death. They just literally, oh, well, they were going to die anyway. This is pre-1700. Got me? Well, what is it that happens that we are going to call now the Enlightenment? Well, it's a very simple model now. We will talk about the differentiation, separating, of the value spheres. Got me? as the scientific enlightenment starts to happen, this movement right here happens, where you have the sphere of arts, you have the sphere of morals and the power of the church, and you have the sphere of science. What begins to happen is you have a separating, a differentiating of these value spheres. And by 1700, you begin to see these three domains of influence starting to become domains of influence unto themselves. It will be now that we will mention for the first time the great Francis Bacon, who I will give a full lecture on tomorrow. Bacon is the first great scientific mind of England who will begin to say out loud what he sees as going on here. He is devoutly religious, let's say that. But he will say about religion, religion has its place. It will tell us how to live and act and all of that. But religion needs to stand down in regards to scientific inquiry, and we need to actually begin to study nature through the inductive method, where we will look at phenomenon and try and draw our conclusions, ergo, the scientific method. When the Royal Society, which becomes the most important scientific institution in the history of the West, when the Royal Society of England finally forms, what a concept. Let's put together the brightest scientific minds and we'll do research, we'll present papers, and we'll start to figure out what's going on with this world thing we call nature. When they originally create this institution that becomes, of course, the great universities of the West, and ultimately, of course, this whole thing of why I teach in this room and Mr. Dupree teaches down in that hall. Notice that, right? There's something fundamentally different that happens here versus down there. Some of you have even said that out loud. I don't like English, but I do like science, or I do like math. Aristotle and Socrates would not have understood that. Remember, all there was the study of mathematics for Socrates. He didn't understand this idea of the study of the humanities as somehow being separated. But this differentiation thing does happen. And of course with Bacon, then you have the beginnings of the scientific method. The church is, let's say it out loud, the church is very, very unhappy about this. Why? Because what happens if, for example, we find information in our research of the sciences that somehow go counter to the beliefs of the church? There's a story, for example, in the Bible about the sun supposedly standing still. Well, what happens if we find out that in fact, the earth isn't the center of the universe at all. The sun is the center of the universe and the earth rotates around the sun, and to have the sun in a single place all day long would literally mean the earth stood still. That can't happen if you believe in things like gravity. Uh-oh, now all of a sudden you called into question a fundamental teaching of the church, more particularly its sacred book, the Bible. Bacon will say, no, this is okay because we're going to separate these different value spheres, and we're going to let science do what science has to do, and we're going to let the church do what it has to do with morals. And oh yeah, there's this other thing called the arts, and we're going to let the arts do what it needs to do. Shakespeare is in many ways an early Enlightenment thinker. He will, you noticed this already in the plays, the few plays you studied. He's going to challenge some of the fundamental assumptions about the power of the church, right? Notice in Romeo and Juliet, those kids don't die if that father stands up and says at the beginning of the play, I ain't doing it. I ain't marrying the two of you, right? Shakespeare will constantly call into question the power of the church as being a real good power as opposed to a somewhat not so good power, right? We can see this often in his performances. So as we work, now one last comment. As we work going towards the 20th century, the 20th century is an age in which these three value spheres stop differentiating and begin to disassociate. That is to say, by the 20th century, those three value spheres look like that. There's no contact whatsoever. And ultimately, of the three, which one creates greatest prominence? Which one gains most power? Science, absolutely. Which is why today you can go and major as a poet, and you're going to get certain kind of money, or looks even, if you say, I'm a major poet, as opposed to I'm going to be an engineer. Now, why is that? Why is it majoring in an engineer is going to get you more bank coming out of school than majoring as a poet? Well, some would argue because majoring as an engineer is more important. That will be, by the 20th century, the major dynamic. And, let's say it out loud, that tension between religion and science will come full bore by the 20th century with the complete disassociation of those value spheres, where science becomes then so important. Some would call it scientism. We'll get to that later. Come back tomorrow. We'll talk a little bit about Francis Bacon as the first of the great Enlightenment thinkers. Thank you.